Okay. Hi, everybody. Oh, that's not the where I want to start. Okay, there we go. Uh, this is going to be a seminar for the concept of federalism. This is your last standard for government at Iowa Big. And yeah, we're going to tie it back to the concept of cake. Federalism can be kind of a tricky subject, and so we're going to try to make this as easy to understand as possible. All right, so here's our objective here. So number one, we just want you to be able to define federalism, or at least understand the concept of federalism, what it is, why it exists, like what that looks like in your everyday life. And then number two, understand the differing viewpoints of on balance of power between federal, state, and local government on the issue of COVID-19. We're going to tie that back to an issue that I guess we can all relate to in some capacity. We've all lived through COVID-19 and kind of know what the effects of that have been. So here we go. So what we would typically do if we were sitting in a seminar is we'd probably start with these three questions. So what decisions do you believe that your parents or guardians should make for you? What decisions do you believe you should be able to make by yourself? And then what decisions should be made cooperatively? Now, you're probably thinking to yourself some of those bigger life decisions. Maybe that's a team effort. Day-to-day decisions like what time you're going to leave for school. Maybe you're like that really falls on you. How you decide to spend your paycheck. Maybe there's bigger decisions that you just don't feel like you're in a position to make, and that's really something that should fall on your parents. This is, in a nutshell, is a really great comparison to what federalism is, right? And so federalism, it is the division of powers among local, state, and national governments. And we're going to walk through kind of the history, the backstory to federalism, kind of why we have a federalism in our country, and some of the beauty of it, some of the struggles with it, and all that good stuff. Okay, so if you think back to the very foundations of our country, and maybe you learned about this in your U.S. history class, maybe you did, or you don't remember, or maybe you just never learned this. Early on in our country's history, there's a big conversation about how much power should be given to a central government, the federal government. You're just coming off a war with Great Britain. They kind of wanted to be able to make many colonists and early American citizens. They wanted to be able to start their own country. But depending on the region that you were living in, you might have had unique needs. So while there was some support for a strong central government, there was also some support for state governments, that the government's purpose, mere existence, was to protect individual liberty. Whereas maybe those that supported a national government, the Federalists, they wanted a big government. They believed that government is what a strong central government is what provided people their liberty and so forth. All right, so you had two parties that emerged. You had Federalists. They wanted big government, anti-Federalist state powers. Federalists, you start to see Alexander Hamilton kind of come into the scene. And then anti-Federalist, you had Thomas Jefferson kind of arguing on behalf of the states. So John Marshall, he ends up becoming a Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Later in his life, he was notably quoted as saying that the Continental Army was nearly destroyed by the indifference of the states. The Articles of Confederation was a really great example of a government who maybe leaned a little bit too far on the side of providing states the power or giving them the power versus having a balance between having a strong central government, but also allowing for states to have their own power. And this is kind of where you see the Constitution come through after the Articles of Confederation falls flat on its face, because states, basically, if states were in turmoil, they were on their own. The central government didn't have the funds. They didn't have federal taxes. They had state taxes. And so if a state was struggling, they couldn't go to the central government and say, hey, we really need your help. It was actually the federal government that had to ask the states for money. So it was a little bit backwards. So you saw just a little bit of clashing there. Each state actually had the power, the authority to come up with their own form of currency and their own coin and value for those coins. Yeah, Articles of Confederation, it just kind of flopped. So, but the spirit of the Articles of Confederation, which preserved and gave power to states, was present within the Constitution of the United States of America, because it allows, and I'll show you here in a little bit, but the 10th Amendment, basically whatever is not spelled out in the Constitution for the federal government and their powers is then reserved for state powers. All right. So the 10th Amendment reads, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So there are two things here that I want to point out. Number one is the necessary and proper clause, also known as the elastic clause. In the Constitution, it's the federal government's responsibility to, I guess, make laws on behalf of the general welfare and to protect the general welfare of the United States and citizens of the United States, which, if you think about it, is an incredibly vague power that's given to the federal government and Congress. And so when it and then there's the supremacy clause, and this kind of, those two go hand in hand. So essentially, the supremacy clause, when it comes down to it, mano a mano, federal government versus state government, the federal government really reigns supreme. So the 10th Amendment kind of allows states to, have some of the make laws and rules and regulations that are not spelled out in the Constitution for the federal government. But there's a lot of gray area, and this is where a lot of conflict comes up. So if you think about, like, even like an airplane or and it's polluting the air. Like who controls that space? What if it's over a particular state and a state wants to provide restrictions or outline restrictions on airspace, or they have certain carbon emission laws that kind of prohibit cars that are being driven in other states. So you just have this conflict between states and what states can do and what the federal government can do. Okay, so this is where cake comes into the picture. So if you think about cake, dual federalism, this kind of goes back to the early part of the United States where federalism is present. You see more dual federalism. There is, let me see here. So essentially power between the federal government and the state governments is very clearly defined. There's really no cooperation between the two. You don't see states reaching out to the federal government for assistance. You don't see federal government providing funds or resources to the states or individual states. And so you see a very defined line. That's why that's called a layer cake. If you kind of think about a layer cake, there's a nice layer of frosting between the top and the bottom layer, or if you're a 3-layer cake kind of person, between the top, middle, and bottom layers. But then you start to see more of a cooperative form of federalism. So power is still divided, and I'll kind of show you that here in a bit, but it's more of a working relationship. And so that's more of the marble cake. It's a little bit more swirled together. The elastic boundaries kind of allow the federal government to support states as needed. States can still kind of work with the federal government and reach out to them for their help. Creative and competitive federalism are really two types of cooperative federalism. So creative federalism is going to be like the federal government deciding what a state needs and then providing those resources. So the federal government is identifying the problem, like maybe it's they identify that there's an education issue in that state, and they decide what resources are necessary, and then they provide those resources for the state. And most often when that's happening, there's a stipulation that if the federal government's coming in to help, the state's going to be responsible for helping out with that too. It's not just going to be the federal government coming in to save the day. Like, they're not saving anybody by itself. Taxpayers within the states and state governments, they've got a responsibility to step up and and kind of accept some of that responsibility too. Competitive is more about like the federal government having some money. Let's say it's transportation. Let's say the transportation department has a bunch of money, and they say, "Hey, we'll give you some money here, but if you accept this money, you have to make this a 55 mile per hour highway." You know, the state can't decide, well, we want to do a 65. So the federal government's kind of deciding ahead of time, like, you can have this money. States, you can kind of compete and try to get that money from the federal government. But if you do accept it or you're awarded that money, then maybe it's like through a grant or something, then you have to kind of follow what we think, you know, like that case, a 55 mile per hour zone, what you think needs to be done there. All right, so that's federalism and cake. This is like a very broad and kind of girthy overview of how powers are divided between the federal governments, state governments, and then what kind of powers are shared between the two. So obviously we have federal taxes, but we also have state taxes. So, you know, both federal and state governments can levy taxes. You know, the road system, you know, both are responsible for building and kind of maintaining the road system. You know, state governments, though, they have the opportunity and the ability to conduct elections. You know, they kind of oversee schools and education. The federal governments, they get to determine the value of money and what kind of money gets produced. They get to determine, well, they get to declare war, which hasn't happened in a long time. They can, God, what am I blanking on? They can establish post offices, because post offices, you know, mail is a federal program. They can make treaties with other nations. They can, you know, they can maintain the army and the Navy and stuff like that. So you see some shit. You kind of see how the federal government has some defined powers. You see how the state has some defined powers. But there is some overlap. You start to see some of that overlap where they're both responsible for, you know, taxes and taking private land and just the enforcement of laws in general. Okay, so you start to see federalism in everyday issues. So there's three that I just thought of kind of off the top of my head. Immigration's a really good example. So this really ties in what the federal law can do, or what federal government states, what the states feel they can do, and then also individual rights, so your First Amendment rights. So in the case of immigration, Arizona looked to pass a very strict bill that made it very difficult for migrants seeking to enter the state. I think it was going to make it so difficult for illegal immigrants or illegal migrants undocumented migrants to get into the state or out of the state, that it would prevent any from coming in. I don't know all the contents or the detail of the bill, but essentially what happened was the Supreme Court decided that actually stepped over a person's First Amendment rights, some of those basic human rights that we have in this country, or liberties that we have as within our country. So the federal government essentially stepped in and said, we're gonna throw out that ban, we're gonna throw out that bill, and you know, that supremacy clause, when it comes down to it, mano a mano, the federal government really reigns supreme here. They're providing for the general welfare of people. Same-sex marriage, you know, states, they could determine what they want their marriage laws to look like. But again, this is one that came down to a person's individual liberties, and a Supreme Court case, gosh, I think it was within 5 or 6 years ago, actually threw out all those bans, essentially allowing for same-sex marriage within their states. You still see some conflict, and that's where it gets a little bit hairy. Minimum wage, this hasn't really, it hasn't happened yet, but there's been some discussion about this. So, you know, whether states should have the ability to should they be left to determine their minimum wage? Can the federal government step in and say, well, this is like something that we need to do for that general welfare, and beef up the federal government? Or states are kind of arguing, well, 10th Amendment, like it's not in the Constitution that says they can make the minimum wage $15. 10th Amendment, we should be able to say and make the minimum wage whatever we want it to be. And so, that's not something that's played out. I think I think most recently that's been somewhat shot down. So, okay. So recent years, I would say even within like the last year, if you think about COVID-19, so different things that have been, that there have been some disagreements on. Number one, whether the federal government could force local police to follow federal guidelines. Can the big dogs, can the feds, can they come in and enforce local police officers, City of Marion Police, City of Alburnett Police, to follow those big federal guidelines? There's a lot of, that would require a lot of human capital to try to have boots on the ground and try to force them into following federal guidelines. Maybe they could kind of threaten not giving money to our state. Disagreement on whether local governments could create public health restrictions that were different from the state's orders, and then whether state governments could set healthcare laws that were different from federal laws. And so you just think about, Obamacare, that was a big federal program that kind of disallowed individuals from deciding whether they could have insurance or not. It really required people to it kind of simplified, I suppose, the insurance process, health insurance process, but that states kind of felt like that disallowed competition between healthcare providers, which is a more of a capitalist approach. All right, so let's talk a little bit about COVID-19. Okay, so that's not the right weight room. Okay, here we go. All right, so for the weight room, number one, I guess I want you to be thinking about what makes federalism awesome and necessary. So that balance in that kind of that working relationship between the federal government, state government, and even local government and state government. But what parts of it do you see that kind of help you to understand why that might be a source of conflict? All right, so just why is it awesome and why might it be kind of frustrating? Because there's really a little bit of both. There are two quotes for letter B. So for letter B, there are two quotes about reopening. One's about schools, and then one is about businesses, I believe, during COVID-19, that both kind of deal with different levels of government that are clashing a little bit over what to do. And so there's 4 questions that are tied to each one. And then lastly, COVID-19, it's obviously affected all of us. Should lower levels of government, so local or state government, be allowed to make their own public health laws during a crisis? Or do you feel as though that's something that should be left to the federal government, the big government? Is that something that you think should be left to a bigger, more unified force like the federal government? Or is that something that individual states or even local governments, City of Marion, City of Cedar Rapids, City of Alburnett, and all these other communities, should they be left to be able to make their own public health decisions, right? Because remember, when a person's decisions impede on another person's individual liberties and rights, that's a problem. So, there's a lot of things that are at play here. All right, try to do this as soon as you have a little bit of time to sit down and look at it. Graduation's coming up quick, and so let's try to get everything wrapped up before the end of May. And if you have any questions, let me know, and then I would love to help you out. Just keep me posted. All right. Good luck, everybody.